A man had collapsed at her doorstep, holding a newborn in his arms, with no name, no plea, only the tremble of a life too fragile for the cold western earth. She didn't know who he was, but that day, instead of locking her door, Clara Wynne opened it, and nothing was ever the same again. Late afternoon, shadows leaned long across the cracked earth. Wind swept red dust through the yucca grove, dry as the parched land. Clara Wynne was splitting firewood, sleeves rolled to the elbows, each axe stroke steady and firm. Her horse in the stable tapped its hoof softly. A strong gust scattered straw from the porch roof. Clara looked up, her eyes narrowed toward the eastern trail. No one ever came at this hour. Then, a sound. Not a knock, just something lightly scraping the wood, weak as if afraid to be heard. She set the axe down, not rushed, but her stride shifted. Her father had once fallen in the snow returning from church. Prayer hadn't kept his blood warm. Since then, Clara hadn't believed anyone listened when she spoke. The front door creaked open. The wind had nudged it ajar without her knowing. She placed a hand on the knob, pushed, and he collapsed like rotted timber. A man, hair matted with sweat, lips cracked, dried blood clinging to his collar. Against his chest, a baby wrapped in old cloth, bruised red from dust and cold. The baby whimpered softly, did not cry, just the sound of wind caught between stones. Clara knelt. The infant's tiny hand clutched the man's shirt, gripping like a root desperate to hold its soil. She felt his neck, pulse slow. The wind shifted. A crow passed overhead. Clara lifted the baby, unhooked the father's fingers from the cloth. So gently, her own hands trembled. She cradled the child and rose. Before stepping inside, she glanced once at the empty land. No one knew who they were, but she had opened the door. Clara didn't think much when she pulled the man's arm over her shoulder. He was heavy, but not heavier than the silence that blanketed the sky at that moment, a silence that made one understand. If you didn't act, no one would. She helped him inside, lighting no lamp. The glow from the wood stove was golden enough to make out every line of dust etched on the wooden floor. A small house, 2 rooms, no cross-hung, no photographs of family. Only a soot-darkened brick stove, a long wooden table with 2 chairs, a single iron bed covered in an old blanket. The scent of dry pine, cold ash, and hay aired out from the day before. She laid the baby on a small sheepskin-covered cushion near the stove. It didn't cry, didn't even whimper. Its eyes were open, staring at the shadows on the ceiling as if already more familiar with strange ceilings than familiar arms. Clara kindled the stove. The wood cracked like a lazy beast stirring. Firelight danced across her face, hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, and a gaze that seemed to have left all dreams behind in a place with no name. She boiled water, set a cast-iron pot on the trivet, then turned back. No question of his name, no search for wallet or papers. The man lay motionless on the floor near the hearth, his breath steady but labored. His shirt was stained, not fresh but old blood, crusted into dark brown streaks across his waist and left shoulder. One hand still loosely clutched the fabric where he had once shielded the child. Clara took off her outer coat, hung it on a hook, then pulled a clean cloth from a drawer, the kind she used to polish her few precious things. But now it would wipe blood from a stranger, not out of faith, because her conscience still breathed. She washed her hands, then turned to prepare food for the infant. There was still some powdered milk in the cupboard. She mixed it with warm water in an old glass liquor bottle, cleaned the previous winter. An aged rubber nipple, softened in hot water, fit snug on the mouth of the bottle. The baby didn't need coaxing. It latched on as if it had held that bottle 100 times, as if it had learned to drink life no matter whose hand offered it. Clara sat there, watching it feed. 2 tiny hands rested on the bottle, like a crooked, godless gesture of prayer. Outside, the wind kept scratching at the window like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Inside, only the crackle of fire and the breath of three souls, one asleep, one alive, one yet to belong anywhere. She fetched an old blanket and laid it over the man. It had once belonged to her father. The smell of sweat, tobacco, and winters past still clung to it. A piece of him, the only one who ever taught her how to survive on land that required no one's pity. A draft through the door crack snuffed the candle on the table. Clara didn't relight it. She sat down in the chair, hands in her lap, staring into the space between the two strangers, as if quietly asking herself, did I just let someone into my home? Or did I just step into someone else's life without knowing it? She didn't believe in God. Not since that winter. But tonight, as the wind changed and a man carrying a child collapsed at her door, she felt her heart tremble, not from fear, but from something even more fragile, a weighting she hadn't known she still carried. The baby finished feeding. It looked up at her for a brief moment, a gaze that knew neither fear nor gratitude. Just a gaze, the way all newborn souls look before they learn how to judge this world. She sighed, stood, and tossed more wood into the stove. The night would grow colder before dawn. The man would live, or not. The baby would cry, or not. But tonight, beneath a roof with no cross, there was fire, there was breath, and there was a woman who was no longer sure she was as hardened as she had once believed. The next morning there was no rain, nor sunshine. Only the dull gray of a western sky, still undecided, whether to keep punishing the land with wind or to soften just enough to offer a hint of warmth. Clara stood in front of the livestock shed, her old straw hat shading most of her face. She lifted a pail of feed mixed with corn and bran, scattering it in a narrow trail. The scrawny cattle ambled over slowly, hooves sinking into the dry earth like trudging through memory. Each one had a name. Though she never called them aloud, each knew its place. They were like her, not friendly, not submissive, but loyal to the act of surviving. The ranch sat on a patch of prairie no one contested. No one even wanted it. A few acres of barren soil, a 10-foot-deep well, a leaning fence. Beyond the fence was abandoned land. No trees, no hoofprints, just dust curling in the wind and a few ash streaks from a fire 2 years past. Every morning Clara rose with the sun. No clock, no one to wake her. Habit was the only thing that kept a person from rotting from the inside out. She went back into the kitchen, tossed more wood into the stove. The man still hadn't woken. The baby slept in a basket woven from willow branches, now lined with soft cloth placed near the fire. Clara boiled water, brewed black coffee, no sugar, no milk. She drank it like she drank the truth, unadorned. She looked around the house once more, not to check, but to remember why she'd stayed here all this time. Her father, Thomas Wynne, used to sit in that corner puffing his pipe, reading old law books, a gruff man, fair, lonely as a stone in the hills. He'd died in winter, right under the eaves. No groan, no last words. Clara had dug his grave with her bare hands. The shovel had snapped. Since then she hadn't cried. Her hands were calloused, not from age, but from earth. Earth that had never bloomed. Only grown weeds and memory. Once, 6 summers ago, a land broker suggested buying the ranch, promised to turn it into a stop for the train line heading toward Utah. He promised plenty, but Clara stayed silent, letting her old dog nip at his pant cuff as he backed off the porch. She lived alone, not because she wanted to, but because she had tried living differently. And this land left no room for those who hoped for more than a single rainy season. And yet, through all those years, there had always been a clean blanket folded neatly on the shelf, A small wooden stool, always stored upside down by the stove, easy to set upright if ever needed. A bottle of plum liquor, unopened, kept in a drawer waiting for an occasion that never came. She didn't call that hope, just habit, like resting a hand over your chest as you sleep, like leaving a door slightly ajar, even knowing no one would knock. This morning there was a man lying in her home, a child breathing steadily in a basket, and the silence in the kitchen seemed to have shifted color, slightly lighter, as if the house itself had stopped waiting. Clara stepped out onto the porch. A soft breeze stirred. The sky still hadn't made up its mind. She stood there for a long while, eyes drifting toward the dirt road in the distance, the place where yesterday red dust had risen, and a nameless body had fallen, carrying a soul no one had ever welcomed. And here, in this soil too dry to easily grow people, Clara understood. What takes root here is not easily torn away. Evening came in a light as pale as ash, not yet night, no longer day, the kind of light that made everything look as if time had washed it colorless. Clara had just gathered the last of the dry firewood when the old horse in the stall began to stir. It never fussed, unless there were unfamiliar hoofbeats within half a mile. She straightened, listened. Hoofbeats, definite, 3 horses, not rushed, but steady, like the gait of men who already knew where they would stop. Clara circled behind the house toward the windmill, where the view stretched the farthest. Just as she'd sensed, 3 horsemen appeared from the northwest, dust-covered long coats, low-slung guns, hands relaxed, but ready. They weren't lost, and they weren't looking for water. They knew the way, they knew a name, and they were searching for something that ought never to be found. Clara turned back, not hurried, but her hand rested lightly on the door bolt. Inside, the man was still unconscious. The child still curled in sleep, a bundle of breath. The 3 riders halted right in front of the porch. They didn't dismount. One, blond, straw-haired, and dry-eyed, tipped his hat back and asked, "We're looking for a man named Joshua Kane. Might be traveling with a child. He's a wanted man." Clara stood at the threshold, not blocking the way, not stepping back. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes passed over each man's face, not searching for answers, but measuring the weight of the lies they carried. The second one, dark-haired, in a worn military cloak, spoke. "He kidnapped the child of a woman from the Brunswick family. That baby has important blood." Clara raised her chin, met his gaze. Wind tugged at her coat, blew wisps of hair across her cheek. She replied, voice flat as the earth, "I haven't seen anyone. There's no one here but me." No wasted movement, no tremor in her voice. Just a sentence laid down like a stone across a road. The 3 men looked at one another. Then the blonde one gave a laugh, humorless. "If you had, what would you do?" Clara didn't answer. She simply stepped back and closed the door. The hinge creaked softly, but the sound was final, like a sentence passed. Behind the wooden door, her palm was slick with sweat, not from fear, but because now there was no turning back. Outside, hooves turned in place. One of the men spat. It caught the wind. And then they all rode off. Not fast, as if they wanted their hoofbeats to linger in the ears of whoever remained inside. Clara did not move, her hand still on the bolt. She didn't know who Joshua Kane was, but she knew one thing for certain. Anyone hunted like that couldn't be entirely wrong, just as no one was entirely right in this land. The wind picked up. On the table, the stove flame flickered. The baby shifted in its basket. The man groaned faintly, lips moving. Clara didn't step away from the door just yet. She stood there a long while, staring at the hoofprints pressed into the dusty yard, like questions no one had answered in time. And for the first time in many years, 2 words surfaced quietly in her mind. Protect someone. Not the land, not herself, but something more fragile, something she'd thought she'd never hold in her hands again. The next day, Joshua woke as sunlight slipped through the cracks in the curtain. Light mingled with the scent of old ash, charred wood, cold coffee, and the human scent of someone who had lived too long beneath the open sky. He didn't open his eyes right away. He just breathed, as if checking whether he was still alive or simply lying inside a forgotten dream. Beside his ear, the wind tapped gently against the wooden wall, like the tired beat of an old heart. Clara sat at the kitchen table, peeling potatoes. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak. No question. Who are you? No, why? She dropped a slice into the cast-iron pan, poured in lard, and the soft sizzle that followed sounded more like a warning than welcome. Neither of them explained why they were in the same space. Neither tried to walk backward into the past. Joshua sat up, blankets tangled. His shoulder ached. Dried blood crusted beneath the frayed fabric. He touched the glass bottle that had held milk, now empty, but his child was still asleep, mouth smudged with traces of white. Clara had cleaned the child, wrapped it in a blanket, placed it by the stove. Under the wooden floorboards, she had slid a sheepskin rug. Joshua looked at the baby as if it were the only proof left that this world had ever been warm. He didn't touch it, just let his gaze settle, slowly, like he feared even breathing too hard might make it disappear. By noon, Joshua staggered out into the yard. Clara had already filled 2 buckets from the well. She didn't invite his help, but he stepped forward, without a word, grabbed the chain of the windmill pulley, wiped sweat from his brow. His hands were calloused, movements sure, like someone who had lived this kind of life before, quiet, hard, with no one to impress. By evening he'd patched the barn door, fixed a horse's hoof, cleared out the wet hay left soggy from old rain. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her gaze free of judgment, simply the way someone looks when silence is no longer a stranger. At one point, he paused, staring toward the far fence line, where days before the wind had brought 3 men. He didn't ask, didn't speak, didn't plead, didn't explain. That night, Joshua warmed milk in the bottle she'd left by the stove. He held it as though it were part of a ritual he'd never learned, but now had to figure out alone. His child drank with a terrifying calm, as if it had been born knowing everything was temporary. Clara passed by. Slowly, she looked at the scene like someone who had once lost something similar, something she could no longer name, no longer hold, but still remembered the feeling of it resting in her hands. No one asked why Joshua was here. No one spoke of where he might go. No one mentioned that the gunman might return. There was only presence, raw and unfiltered, full of sweat, raspy coughing, and the shallow breaths of a baby too young to know it had just been saved. And strangely, in that silence, something like an old faith began to stir again. Not the eager faith of youth, but the kind that had once been broken and somehow still held onto a root, deep in dry ground. Night fell, the wind slapped against the windows, the oil lamp flickered. Joshua sat repairing the torn reins of a saddle, each stitch slow as if mending a piece of memory that had rotted through. Clara, in the corner by the hearth, dried a wooden bowl. Her hands paused for a moment, then resumed. Neither looked at the other. Neither smiled, but both understood. The other's presence was not a burden. And maybe, for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt entirely alone. Night fell like a heavy blanket, settling over the wooden roof with the long, weary exhales of the land. The wind had calmed, but still whispered through the window frames, a quiet reminder that peace was never permanent in a place like this. Outside, the moon was not yet full, just a shard of silver drifting behind gray clouds. casting a faint glow onto the smoke-stained walls of the wooden house. Joshua had dozed off beside the saddle. He'd just finished stitching. His shoulder leaned against the wall, one hand still resting on the reins, as if afraid they might vanish in his sleep. Clara moved quietly through the kitchen, cleaning up the space the way someone does when they're used to living beside another's exhaustion. Then, in the stillness of that night, came the sound of sleep-talking. Not clear, not full sentences, but in the middle of those choked murmurs, a name surfaced. Anna. Just one word, like a stone tossed into a still lake. Then silence thickened again. Clara stood by the sink. Dishcloth paused in her hand mid-air. She didn't turn, didn't ask. She simply folded the cloth, laid it gently on the table, as if folding away a thought that didn't need to be reopened. Joshua continued breathing, heavy. His face wasn't twisted in pain, but worn, like someone who had crossed through something larger than life itself. Clara walked over, added more wood to the fire, then sat down in her chair. Her eyes drifted toward the basket where the child slept, still unmoving, as if needing no lullaby, no soothing, as if already familiar with being alone in the dark. The next morning the sky turned clear, unexpectedly. The wind stopped. The sun rose, pale gold, but more certain than usual. The kind of sky that didn't exactly inspire belief in good things, but made you stop wanting to reject them outright. Joshua was up early. He said nothing about the night before, didn't look at Clara longer than necessary, but when he saw the broken gate latch, the hinge rusted through by 2 rainy seasons, he knelt, pulled an old knife from his pocket, and started the repair. He worked with a focused silence, as if each piece of fallen iron was a part of himself that needed reassembling. Clara brewed coffee. The smell of smoke from the wood stove spread through the house. She leaned against the doorframe, watching the man hunched in the morning light, mud on his boots, sweat sliding down his brow and vanishing into his collar. A question almost escaped her lips. "You used to have a home, didn't you?" But instead, she simply handed him a wooden mug and muttered, "Coffee's gone cold." Joshua took it, nodded slightly, didn't linger with his eyes. No one smiled. No one said more. But somewhere inside them, something had started to take root, nameless, undefined. No one dared to name it, for fear that naming would demand it prove itself real. And sometimes the unspoken things are the ones that last the longest. Rain began to fall at midday. No warning, no thunderclap, just quietly, steadily, like an old friend tapping gently on the wooden roof. Clara was feeding the horse when she heard the soft patter against her hat. She looked up, letting the drops run down her face without wiping them away. March on the prairie was usually dry, but sometimes the sky remembered people. Inside, the baby stirred, a fine sheen of sweat on its small brow, cheeks flushed red, eyelids fluttering unevenly, like a small flame about to go out. Clara lifted the child, touched its neck. Hot. She pressed her forehead to its forehead, a gesture instinctive, ancient, something her mother had once done for her whenever she was sick. Joshua, who'd been mending the fence out back, heard the door swing open with force. He turned to see Clara standing there, soaked in rain, her eyes absent of fear, but filled with an unspoken command. "It has a fever." Joshua froze. His face went pale, as if someone had pulled the breath from his chest. He stepped inside, pulled off his gloves, bent to look at the child in Clara's arms. It whimpered faintly, one tiny hand clutching at her shirt, searching for something safe without a name. Joshua yanked open a cloth bag holding bits of field medicine he'd kept. His hands shook. Not from cold, but from memory. I left Anna to go fetch medicine. When I came back, it was too late." The words broke into the room like a blade slicing through the quiet. No one had asked him to speak, and no one was required to listen. Clara didn't ask, "Who's Anna?" Didn't judge, didn't offer pity. She simply took the child from him, sat near the stove, and placed the baby against her chest, right where her heart beat softly beneath the ribs. She held it as if it were the last warmth left from the other side of life. The fire in the stove flared deeper red. Joshua stirred the medicine in a chipped enamel cup. He held it out to her, eyes pleading, but didn't push. Clara blew gently on the liquid, then fed it to the child, one small spoonful at a time. The baby resisted for a moment, then swallowed. Its eyelid twitched. No one said anything about hope. There was no, "It'll be all right." Only the sound of rain on the roof, the crackle of wood, and the quiet rhythm of 3 heartbeats, syncing together like the pulse of a family unaware it was already becoming one. Joshua remained standing. He didn't sit. He watched her, as if witnessing something miraculous, not because she was skilled, not because she saved the child, but because she didn't walk away. Clara didn't look back, but for the first time she didn't feel cold when holding a child that wasn't her own. Something had begun to sprout from the deepest crack. Not love, not forgiveness, just the real presence of 2 human beings at the exact moment they needed each other most. Early morning, when the rain was nothing more than damp stains on the windowsill, Clara gathered the pile of damp old clothes to hang along the porch. She didn't pay much attention to what Joshua was doing inside, a habit that had quietly settled in after many days of coexisting without the need for questions. The first light of day slanted across the wooden roof, drying patches of mud clinging to boots, warming the shoulders of someone surviving by silence. While folding Joshua's old coat, Clara noticed a small edge of paper peeking from the inner pocket. Her hand paused, not out of curiosity, but because sometimes secrets are so heavy, even paper can't hide them. She pulled it out, a scrap of handwritten letter, ink smudged, creased and wrinkled like it had been crumpled, then smoothed again. The paper was frayed at the edges, spotted with dried blood. Whether from battle or something more painful, it wasn't clear. Clara didn't read it right away. She placed it on the table, sat down, poured herself a cup of coffee, bitter, no sugar, and only then unfolded the letter like opening an old drawer in someone else's heart. "Anna, if you're reading this, then maybe I have nothing left but the child. I don't know where I went wrong. Was it when I left you that winter, or when I believed I still had time to return? Forgive me if I never learned how to be a father. I've gone too far, and I'm afraid I'll never find the way back." Clara finished reading. She didn't sigh, didn't shed a tear. She looked out the window and saw Joshua holding the baby, gently wiping its face with a warm cloth. The child didn't cry, only leaned toward his hand like a young shoot stretching for sunlight. The letter lay on the table. A breeze from the door crack lifted one corner of the page, as if trying to turn it back over. Clara stood. She picked up the letter and walked to the stove, kindled a small flame, placed the paper into the fire. Her hand steady, the paper burned slowly. Ink bled into ash. The name Anna faded like something that had once been real, but no longer had anything left to hold on to. Joshua stepped back inside, noticing the stove burning brighter than usual. He didn't ask. Clara didn't speak. They simply passed one another, like 2 people carrying wounds, but long accustomed to dressing them alone. And in that silence, a lie was born. Not to hide something cruel, but to protect what little still remained. Not to deceive him, but to let tomorrow arrive without dragging yesterday's crying behind it. That afternoon, Clara was unloading grain outside the old shed when she heard the sound of hooves coming from the south. Not hurried, not pressing, but steady, like the heartbeat of someone who'd just survived a heart attack. Joshua was chopping wood behind the house. He lifted his head, hand still gripping the axe handle. They looked at each other for a moment. No one asked, "Who's that?" No one said, "Get inside." It was just, both of them knew. Something had picked up the scent of old smoke. The last light of day cast a tarnished gold across the dusty yard. Dust rose with each step of the horses. 4 men. No uniforms, no badges, just long coats the color of ash, coated in road dust, and eyes that knew the smell of blood. The one in front stopped his horse at the edge of the porch. He didn't dismount, just tilted his head toward Clara, like someone come to reclaim what was never his, and didn't feel the need to explain why. Clara stood at the door, holding a basket of dried corn. She didn't set it down. Joshua stepped up behind her, staying in shadow. The baby was sleeping inside, in the woven cradle strung near the stove. The man spoke, not loudly, but each word as sharp and clear as wind slicing through stone. "We'll be back. 3 days." No one asked, "Back for what?" But he answered anyway, as if he'd heard the question buried in silence. "If the child's not here, we'll take the land." Then he pulled the reins. The other 3 turned with him like hawks that had already swept across an open field. Their hoofbeats receded, not once looking back. The wind picked up. The stench of saddle leather, sweat, and gunpowder still hung in the air, as if the land had just been marked by something that hunts. Clara said nothing. Joshua stepped inside. He looked at the child, still sleeping. Its tiny hand brushed against the edge of the blanket, gripping it with the instinct of something not ready to fall from shelter. The wooden house was as still as the mouth of a deep well. No questions were spoken aloud. Only truth lay there, heavy on the floor, like the old rifle resting on the wooden hook above the hearth. They knew. 3 days. Not for thinking, but to choose how to hold on to something they'd never asked for, but could no longer let go. Night fell. The oil lamp on the dinner table cast just enough light to see a face, but not enough to see through thoughts. Clara sat across from Joshua. The baby was already asleep. Dinner was mashed potatoes, some red beans, and stale cornbread. Neither touched their plate more than 3 times. Joshua set his spoon down first. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice low and hoarse like an old horse after a long day's ride. "I'm leaving." "No, I think I should." "No, maybe it's best." Just a conclusion. Dry as drought season earth. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at him, eyes not angry, not surprised, only holding something too familiar with loss, about to lose one more thing. Then she stood, walked to the corner of the room, reached beneath an old chair and pulled out a wooden box, opened it. From inside, she took a heavy, aged revolver, its grip engraved. It was her father's gun, the one he'd kept through 3 dry seasons, never fired a single shot, but always believed it wouldn't fail him if the moment came. Clara set the gun on the table, slid it gently toward Joshua. She didn't say, "Take it." She didn't say, "Don't go." She just stood there, hands still dusted from the stove, eyes still marked with the dampness of last night not yet fully dried. "I don't want to run," she said, her voice like wind pushing through a dry door frame. "But if you're leaving, then let me stay with the boy." The room went silent like the moment after the first gunshot, when no one yet knows who's fallen. Joshua looked at the revolver, but his eyes weren't on the barrel or the grip. They were on Clara's hands, hanging at her sides, trembling slightly, but unhidden. And he understood. It wasn't that she feared the fight, and it wasn't that she couldn't survive alone. It was that, this time, she wanted to stay for someone else. And that's harder than any battle. Joshua nodded, just barely. Didn't say, "I understand." Didn't say, "I'll stay." He simply picked up the gun, wiped it with his sleeve, then placed it back on the table, between them. a shared object, no longer a weapon, but a witness to a decision. Outside, the wind picked up. The baby stirred in its cradle, let out a sound, half dream, half call. Joshua stepped forward, pulled the small blanket back over its chest. Clara watched him, for the first time, not as a man taking shelter, but as someone trying to walk forward from the wreckage. No one spoke of what would happen. There was no plan laid out, no promises of sacrifice, only silence, spreading like early morning mist, seeping into every wooden groove, every door frame, every small movement of the day, now more meaningful than any vow. The next morning Joshua rose early. He began digging a small pit beside the cottonwood tree behind the house, where the ground was still soft. The baby was laid in a woven cradle nearby, under the sparse shade of the tree's canopy. Clara stepped outside, 2 strands of copper wire in her hand from the stove. She didn't ask, "What are you doing?" She didn't say, "Don't." She knelt and began measuring the size of the shelter door. There was no discussion, but both knew the time might come when a child would need to be hidden from a world too vast, too cruel. Clara strung a wire bell across the front fence. Each faint chime rang through the wind, sounding like sheep grazing at dawn, but also like the first warning from the land itself. Joshua repaired the eastern fence, where the posts had rotted. He hammered with both hands and an old mallet, without a word of complaint. Each nail driven in was like sealing a fear. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of losing the one thing they hadn't yet dared to name. Inside, Clara packed supplies: a water pouch, some milk, 2 clean cloths, a small knife wrapped in goatskin, all placed neatly into the shelter for the child, not as if preparing to flee, but as if preparing to survive with a calm that had no time for panic. Evening came. The wind picked up. No one ate dinner. Joshua sat by the door sharpening a blade. Clara sat sewing a baby shirt, not because it was torn, but because her hands needed something to do to stop from shaking. The child still slept soundly, as if peace were the only thing it chose to believe in. No one mentioned the 3 men who would return. No one spoke of the gun which Joshua had loaded at dawn. Outside, the wind spun dust into small whirlwinds, the scent of smoke, damp earth, the smell of a home waiting for a storm. And when a man repairs a fence, when a woman strings wire bells in silence, when a child is laid in the deepest fold of the earth, that is no longer preparation for a fight. That is preparation for the only thing worth keeping. In the stillness of the prairie, quiet is the loudest sound there is. The 3rd night, the sky pressed heavy, no moon, no wind, still to the point of dread, the kind of silence that comes before violence, like a heartbeat missing a beat. Clara sat beside the cradle reading from a tattered Bible, not out of faith, but because her mother used to read it. Joshua stood on the porch, hand on the latch, eyes fixed westward, flickering light, wrong place, wrong time. It came. A black object hurtled over the fence, a torch. It landed in the livestock shed. Dry straw, old wood, fire screamed. Within breaths, flames bit into the walls. Wind surged. Ash rose. The scent of burning hit like a scream. Clara snatched the baby. Joshua flung open the hatch, placed the child inside, alongside the packed supplies. A kiss on the child's forehead. No promises. Only blood pressed into duty. The wind shifted. Fire swept through the kitchen. Figures crossed the fence. One man, gun in hand. Another crept along the horse stalls. They split up. Joshua charged east. Clara gripped her father's revolver, not to remember him, to fight. Gunfire, one shot, dry, sharp. The first man dropped. Finger never reached the trigger. Joshua wrestled the second behind the barn. A blade slashed into his shoulder. Blood soaked through his shirt. The man pressed the knife to his throat, grinned. Bang! Clara pulled the trigger. The man crumpled, eyes wide, neck blooming red. Joshua gasped, still kneeling. "They thought the baby belonged to the landowner," he said. "It didn't. She was the maid's child. They killed the wrong woman." The third man stood at a distance. He heard it. Truth lit like a live coal. He turned, ran, never looked back. Not out of defeat, but exposure. The fire still raged. Joshua stumbled toward the porch. Clara had lifted the baby from the shelter. The three of them stood together in the red glow, their shadows scorched into the dirt, like the scars they carried. The baby didn't cry. Clara didn't tremble. Joshua, blood soaking his shoulder, smiled. Just a little, very quietly, not because they'd won, but because for the first time he didn't run. The next morning the scent of ash and smoke still lingered in the air. The livestock shed was nothing but a blackened frame. Charred wood pocked and splintered like ribs pried open. The chickens had flown off, the cattle were gone, but the early morning wind felt lighter than usual, not taut with fear anymore, but like something had passed and finished what it came to do. Joshua sat in an old wooden chair, his shoulder wrapped in a torn cloth Clara had boiled and bound tight with strips from an old saddle strap. The blood had dried. The pain remained, but neither spoke of it. Clara was cutting the child's hair behind the house, carefully, each snip of the scissors small, as if trimming fear off a soul too young to know how cruel the world had been to its father. The child sat still, small hands clutching a smooth stone. Now and then it looked up at Clara and smiled, not the kind of smile that meant joy, but the kind that came from recognizing something familiar and wanting it to stay. Inside, Joshua held a folded sheet of paper, not a goodbye, not a confession, just a scrap of words, scrawled with his left hand, uneven but clear enough. "If I get to stay, I'll rebuild the house, plant grain, fix the well, and love everything you have." No signature, none needed. Clara came in, placed the letter on the shelf, the old one where her father's books used to sit. She didn't open it, didn't ask, "Who's it for?" She simply stood still, her hand resting gently on Joshua's shoulder, not as a promise, but as if to say, "I've read it." That evening's fire wasn't for cooking, only for warmth, and for three people to sit together, for the first time, not because they needed shelter, not because of danger, but because they chose to. In that firelight, the man who had once only known how to run stood up, looked out toward the back field, where the cattle used to be, now empty. He said, not loud, not soft, "We'll have to build a new barn." No one replied. Clara kept sewing. The child slept in its cradle, but quietly, in a house that had once held only one person, and the smell of old smoke. Something had changed. No one spoke of the future, but each of them had started to live as if it might be real. The sky changed color at first light. Clouds gathered in long gray bands, heavy as wool blankets draped across the prairie. The swallows flew low, the ants abandoned their hills, and Clara hung a towel out to dry, though she knew the rain would come before it ever had the chance. Joshua was fixing the porch roof. The child crawled across the floor inside, playing with an old pot lid, as if it were the only perfect round world it knew. And then the rain came. Not gentle, not soft or teasing, just straight down, as if the sky had held it too long, as if even nature needed to exhale after a season of waiting. Clara ran inside, shut the windows. Joshua stayed in the yard, neither flinching nor seeking cover. He tilted his face to the sky, letting the rain fall across his skin, his cheeks, his still healing wound. No grimace, no closed eyes, like a man who had, for too long, not allowed himself to feel. The shirt on his back clung heavy and soaked, sticking to his thin frame, ribs showing like dry branches once bent by wind. Clara stood in the doorway watching through the old wooden frame. The child slept quietly in her arms. No crying, no fuss, as if all three of them had agreed that today there was nothing to do, not survive, not defend, not fear, just to be wet, to stand in the rain and not be chased away from anywhere. The rain lasted only 15 minutes, but it was enough. Enough to soften the ground. Enough to wash away the blood, the ash, the footprints. Enough for a man to believe that tomorrow could begin with nothing done wrong. When Joshua stepped back inside, his hair matted to his forehead, Clara handed him a dry towel. Not because he was cold, but because she no longer feared sharing. They sat side by side on the floor, backs resting against the wooden wall. No fire lit, no lamp needed. Only the sound of rain tapering off beyond the eaves. And in that silence, no one needed to say, "We're staying," because neither of them was thinking about leaving anymore. That morning, the sky was strangely clear. After the rain, everything fell silent, as if even the earth was exhaling. The birds returned. Tender grass sprouted along the edge of the dry creek. The house no longer smelled of ash, but of something new, warm, as though the embers had stepped aside to make room for a different kind of soil. Clara cooked breakfast with her sleeves rolled high. Joshua sat on the porch, the child on his lap, his large hand covering almost the baby's entire back. The child leaned against his thigh, giggled, then tumbled backward, and didn't cry. Joshua bent down, scooped the baby up, and looked at it as if realizing this child was no longer the shadow of his past, but the first marker of something he hadn't yet dared to name. Clara stepped out with a cup of coffee, handed it to him. She said nothing. Then she held out a folded piece of paper, old, creased at the edges, but carefully flattened, a handwritten land deed in land. She spoke softly, without looking at him. "This land, if you want to stay, I'll divide it in half, not as charity, but as a right to live." Joshua took the paper, didn't read it right away. He looked at her, not with gratitude, not with hesitation, but like someone who had finally been allowed to step onto the threshold of a place they'd always been kept just outside of. A moment later, he lifted the child, holding it to his chest. The wind passed beneath the newly repaired roof, and the sound of leaves in the breeze was like a blessing whispered by a land bigger than any promise. Joshua said quietly, just enough to be heard, "We have a home now. Little one." Clara didn't respond. She didn't look back. She simply walked inside, opened the cupboard, and took out one more bowl, placed it on the table, not to eat, but to say, "This place has room for three." And for the first time since her father died, Clara didn't think twice when she heard a child begin to cry. Years passed. The men who once threatened them never returned, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because there was nothing left to take. The field beyond the porch now swayed with golden barley, the wind moving through it like waves. The well had been dug 3 feet deeper, the porch roof rebuilt 3 times, and the sapodilla tree Clara had planted from a brittle branch was now bearing small fruit. Joshua built cabinets in the workshop. Clara picked greens in the garden. Only the child, no longer a child, ran circles around the yard, sandals slapping, face smudged with dirt, shouting, "Pa! Pa! Look at this!" Joshua looked up, squinting in the sun. The boy held up a toad, or what he believed was his first treasure in life. Joshua smiled, said nothing, just nodded the way his own father once did. After supper, the boy climbed into his father's lap, his fingers tracing the faded scar on Joshua's shoulder, a relic from the night of fire. He asked, "Where did you live before this, Pa?" Joshua was quiet a moment, then smiled, a rare, unguarded smile. "Somewhere, without you." The boy nodded as if tucking the world into its rightful place. "So I'm your home then?" He didn't wait for an answer. He jumped down and ran off, leaving Joshua sitting there, his hand still holding the warmth where the boy had just been. Clara paused in the garden, hands in the soil, momentarily still. She didn't turn around, didn't say anything, but her hands worked the dirt more gently, as if planting something softer than earth. The end. No music played, no final letter, no goodbyes, because people only say goodbye to places they're leaving, and here, no one needed to go anymore, because they had stayed, and they had chosen each other. In the last light of evening, as the wind stopped cutting through the broken fence and the ashes of that violent night cooled, only the crack of wood in the stove remained, and the soft footsteps of a child running along the porch. It would be hard to believe this place was once the end of a flight, and also the beginning of another kind of life. Clara never needed to know who Joshua used to be. No one asked whose child the boy was. Sometimes on land like this, survival was enough to call someone family, and so they kept living, quietly, without glory, through small acts, sharing a cold bowl of soup, rebuilding a dry well, mending a fence after the storm, in a place where winters come early and forgiveness comes slow. Perhaps love doesn't bloom like something divine, but like wild grass, quiet, stubborn, anchored by the smallest roots. If you've ever opened a door for someone, not knowing who they were, not sure what you'd gain, or if you've ever been the one knocking, just hoping someone wouldn't turn you away, share that story, because maybe your story might give someone the courage to stay, or to begin. You've just heard a story from the West, and maybe also from somewhere inside yourself.